What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the panel members to reflect, to say anything that they haven't had a chance to say, perhaps make some recommends or some action points to take forward from this. Literally in a minute and a half, 2 minutes at max. So I'd like to start with Rachel. Thank you.
I just had initially a couple of examples where being able to refer to the Museum Association Code of Ethics has been useful to me professionally. In Birmingham Museum's very recent move to being a trust, when talking to external and actually the internal legal people and solicitors, demonstrating that we had professional codes was really useful as something they could recognise straight away when you referred to a code of ethics. Apparently, I think probably solicitors work to them. And not just the code of ethics, but also things like accreditation, benchmarks for collections care. Those terms meant something to them with very brief explanation. So you demonstrate your professionalism to other professions. And then again, recently I gave some advice using the Code of Ethics and some other examples to a curator who was being asked to do something she thought was unethical by the chair of her trustees. And that gave her some strength to go back and say, okay, these are the reasons I'm uncomfortable with this suggestion. What's obvious to me today is obviously you all make ethical decisions daily as part of your job. People in museums do, but conservators particularly do because they're interacting very closely with the objects. It's really a case of I know you've got some different codes of ethics, but it's getting something written down that's yours, that's used and implemented and discussed. Some of the things I think will obviously need quite a lot more discussion as part of creating that. Haven't been gone into in any depth today. Discussions on artist intent and authenticity. Very interesting. Sooner or later you need to pin them down if they're going to go into a code of ethics. No code of ethics will obviously pin down all the details, but it really gives you considerations and ways to judge, and it is always a discussion. I think the key thing is it has to stop being a discussion at some point. It has to become decisions. I was thinking about, is the code of ethics for the object, for the conservator, or for the conservator's customer, which obviously includes a paying customer and the public audience. And my last thought was that the public feel an increased ownership of objects, which is, nice and sort of democratic, but that does mean also all the specialists involved with objects are more publicly noticeable, and they're highlighted in PR. I mean, the Hoard is a great example of that. The conservators involved with that are publicly visible and are talking about what they do. But that means you're much more visible as individuals as well as a profession. And that inevitably means there's increased accountability as people start to ask about the person they saw named in the paper. And so that again just brings you back to being able to point to a code of ethics and say that's what we work to. And it sits alongside your accreditation, the Conservatives accreditation. It really demonstrates the profession has professional standards.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Eugene, could I ask you for your reflections and recommend?
I merely have 2 points. Conservation is for future generations, as I understand. Many of the young people today, they are living in an information-rich and digitally connected world. Being digital natives, don't know if you have heard of that term before. They're like fish living in the water. Take them out of that digital, and they are not in their natural habitat. Never mind. So what engages them is the digital. I had a dinner prior to yesterday, with teenagers and their parents whom I know. And in our social interaction time, they were all on their phones, playing games. We were supposed to be talking, but so they're just connected. Now, we have a responsibility to record a lot of information, which is part of the conservation effort, documentation of heritage, and to represent them properly using creative means like gamification, story narratives to inform and teach future generation. And there's also this issue in the fidelity of digitally represented heritage, how they are portraying the right image of the original in the stories being told. Now, this has not been done on many important sites, monuments, text, and behavior. But there's an additional problem. We laser scan a site to record it, potentially informing conservators, avoiding invasive archaeology, but we end up with digital data that needs conservation too. So there's this problem. cycle. Anyways,
Okay.
pass.
Thank you very much, Eugene.
Okay.
Kieran.
Eugene stole some of what I was going to say.
No.
But I mean, in terms of, we all have, as we should say, we all have ethics. We all have a basis of ethics, whether it comes from religion or just our family values. We all have it, whether we recognise it or not. And there's always that core ethics that we abide to, especially in conservation. I mean, there's the core ethics of preservation, not restoration, aspects of that. I mean, it can be dated back to Pietro Edwards, who was hired by the City Council of Venice for preserving Venice. He had 3 rules, which I can't quote right now because I can't remember. But he had the 3 rules, which are more or less the basics of conservation now. But on top of that, we have fluid ethics, ethics that change with society and change with generations. I think if we are going to, as a professional organisation, form a set of ethics, I think we don't form them just for us. We form them for future generations, and we take into account the things that we don't use ourselves. And like Eugene was saying, the technology, like what technology can provide in terms of conservation in the future, in terms of documentations, like is used now in institutions for preserving the records for statues. I mean, that kind of technology might become essential in the future for documentation, and we have to look forward, not just look at now. We have to prepare for future generations, as well as I think that we have to escape the problem of being too UK-centric. We have to be global. It's a global society. Most of us here aren't just from the UK. I'm not from the UK. There's people not from the UK here. We all come from different backgrounds. We all move in different societies, so we can't create a code of ethics which is just UK-centric. It has to be global, because it is a global society, and we're all brought together by special technology. And finally, I'd like to say, in terms of the idea of policing and accreditation, do we need a Hippocratic Oath for conservation to bring us all accountable, that we all follow and say, right, we sign up to this charter? If we go against it, then 1 strike, you're out, not even 3.
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Katie.
To turn this on first. I was kind of expecting this conference to be a bit more about ethics. It seems to have been a lot more about difficult decision making. It has reflected on things largely to do, it seems to me, with understanding the intangible qualities of something and how it is wrapped up in the practice of a professional conservator, when the profession seems to be principally focused upon still the materials of the purpose of the trade. And life has kind of moved on a bit from that. And I think some of the debates we were hearing would have been helped by a clearer understanding of why things had been acquired in the first place and what purpose they were for, as well as putting them, as some people refer to, in the wider context of where they sit in the national sort of an international framework of importance. So it's kind of there, but I think the way that the intangible values are part of the conservator's trade does need to be woven much more strongly into the way that we conceive of practice. It kind of also implies to me, though, that people weren't debating the ethics, the codes of ethics of which we are aware, that they are not massively unfit for purpose, that it may be a tweak and a refreshment rather than a revolution. And the ECHO Code of Ethics is dated 2002, so that's 10 years ago, so that probably is within the natural cycle of things, time for it to be refreshed. And perhaps if ICON is also feeling the need to refresh the codes of ethics, it's an opportunity to have a conversation to get the communities back together again. Because I think, as David was observing, codes of ethics are for various reasons, as many of the delegates have said, and their importance is to give a kind of collective voice to a sector which would otherwise risk being scattered to winds and its advocacy being much weaker as a result. And we are best served by collective practice rather than kind of individual and competing frames of reference. So I think that's just broadly what I want to say. Just the reference to the standards, values, standards. I mean, there's a whole amount of frameworks out there which can be quite exhausting to spend a lot of time to think about, but I think you can find homes for people in there. I think volunteers are reflected in the professional standards because it's all about the kind of novice to expert scale and where you are in your ability to take independent and autonomous decisions. So a lot of it is there. It's a kind of opportunity to perhaps to weave these things together in a more coherent whole.
Thank you very much. Jonathan.
Okay, my worry is that we might end up trying to get very explicit rules back again, and my advice is not to do that. And I'll give you an example from my own experience at the V&A shortly before they got rid of me. They introduced a thing saying you couldn't go out to lunch and have a drink, alcohol. You couldn't drink alcohol at lunch. And I maintained that this was already covered by disciplinary procedures and health and safety legislation, and therefore you did not need an explicit rule within the House, because that removed from me the ability to make a judgment about my actions, and I resented having that judgment removed from me. So I don't think we want to have anything too explicit, so there's still room for judgment. What there has become obvious during the day is that, and it's reinforced, is that codes or ways of behaving grow up within different disciplines, so that we've seen that the industrial fraternity are quite happy with the way they make decisions. The time-based people are happy with the way they make decisions. They don't need a set of rules to tell them that. The rules could, not the rules, things that are written down in terms of codes or guidance could reflect what people currently think at the moment, but so could papers at conferences just reflect what people think at the moment. You don't actually have to set down a set of rules to explain that. One thing that the current set of rules do not do is explain how you deal with hierarchies of values, and there are things like spiritual versus scientific and this sort of thing, where you're left with some area where you have to have a discussion and you have to come up with your own conclusion, most probably on a local basis. One of the things that seemed hadn't been fully within with these hierarchies is the role of the public as a stakeholder. There are times when you think it'd be nice to know what the public wants, and there are times when you think, I'm damned if I'm listening to these ignorant people who want things that I don't want for myself. And I'm reminded that I started work in a museum before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and we should thank Margaret Thatcher for bringing it to our attention that as public servants we have to do what the taxpayer wants. And that's why there's been this growing momentum of thinking that what the public thinks is more important, which can only in the end debase the nature of specialist opinion and knowledge.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jane.
Well, I thought, as we've all been quoting Jonathan a lot, I'd quote Andy instead when he said, let's be honest. Sorry.
I said first.
Let me get you. When I read ethics codes, I read them in two occasions. One when I'm about to go out and do a ACR assessment and I'm going to ask someone what's in their ethics code. And the other time is just before I go and do the lecture on ethics. And I think I'm probably one of the people in the room who reads ethics codes more than other people. So if we're going to be honest, I think one of the questions we have to ask is it the case that the current ethics codes that we have are not massively unfit, or is it the case that the current ethics codes that we have are not massively relevant? What impact do they actually have on our day-to-day life? I was wondering, really, listening to some of the speakers, whether what was being described was an outcome which people felt fairly certain was a correct outcome, which they then rationalised in the language of and terms of ethical codes. But the ethical codes are very much secondary to the outcome which had already been defined as a correct one. Now, if that's the case, and I suppose I was meant to be controversial, is that right? If that's the case, then I suspect that we've managed pretty well without. We haven't really had a code of ethics in ICON so far, have we? It's not done us a huge amount of harm. It's come up a couple of times when we've had disciplinary debates, but I don't know the ins and outs of those disciplinary debates because they are confidential, but I suspect that the disciplinary issues are matters of business practice, behaviour, social ethics, rather than the complex ethics of conservation and conservation practice. So my feeling is that we need to be quite careful to avoid a complicated set of rules, which is my natural tendency. Is that the students who work with me know there's complicated sets of rules attached to everything from a tap to a fume cupboard. But I don't think that that's the way that you deal with ethics. I think that you have to talk about what our values are. You have to talk about what we mean. Perhaps have separate codes of conduct if we have to for people's practice. But ethics, we know them when we see them.
We do, indeed. Thank you very much, Jane. I think that's a great summing up from people picking up different points, but some key themes running through it. What I'd like to do before I sum up myself is give you, the audience, the chance to give us your recommends or thoughts in the last 5 minutes to what we might take forward from this, or reflecting on those reflections of the panel themselves. So I'm opening it to the floor. This is your chance to have the big idea.
Just a quick one, Simon.
Microphone, Mr. Child.
Bob Child. As a result of what you've heard, are the people who deal with the teaching organisations, people like Jane and David, will they change any of their teaching procedures to take into account of the things and the attitudes that they've heard today?
Well, I would like to... David, perhaps talk...
Do the students who get taught think we should as well?
Okay. Well, let's hear from one of the students then. What do you think?
I think at the end of the day, Watkins and Cardiff University, it's food for thought, isn't it? Because when you teach ethics, it's not that there's an answer. It's that if someone mentioned the dictionary definition before of ethics, there's also a statement called situation ethics in the dictionary. And that's how we work. Everything's relative to a situation. There might be a fundamental core of rights and wrongs that you often don't cross, but at the end of the day, you relate your action to the situation, and you build a case to support that one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Is there not?
And people may well disagree with that.
Well, the danger there, because we've talked about pragmatism, is you end up with a pick and mix approach, because you can say, I can justify what I've done because I've taken this bit from there and this bit from there, and therefore I build my case. And that might be perfectly acceptable. David.
To continue that, if you've been well trained, as of course, David Lee, if you've been well trained, as of course you will have been in Cardiff, a few other places, then you will have been given these tools, and learning about ethics will just be one of the tools that you'll have at your disposal. You'll also have experience, and you'll have learnt at your tutor's bench, as it were, and as the years go by, you gain in experience. Then, when decisions are made, you don't normally make a decision on your own, or at least shouldn't do. As I said earlier, I think it should be part of a team effort. So it's the conservator, the owner, all the other stakeholders, including, when appropriate, the visitors and the public, help you to that. But you need, and the value of the teaching here is, it's a fundamental basis of learning, as people always say, like stuff. It's learning how to think, actually. Mm-hmm. And then applying that, as David says, to particular objects. Every object we've heard today raises a different suite of problems, and we have to be good enough to rise to whatever those problems are that are presented to us. And it's a very demanding, very sophisticated decision making we have to undertake, not to be done lightly. And no code of ethics with a tick box is going to help you on its own. It's much more complicated than that, much more sophisticated than the super people that conservators are.
Very good.
Can I just say, I think David summed it up very well there, and no one's actually talked about the opposite aspect of ethics, which, if they are constrained, as you say, they're actually negative in terms of constricting thought processes and actions that you're likely to carry out and development. And that's what you don't want, I think, as you say.
Okay, I'm going to bring proceedings to a close. I've got a few things to say myself, and then some thanks to give, of course. I was handed a communique during the day that's come from Ylva Darnshaw now, isn't she? Yes, Ylva Darnshaw, who is strongly connected with ECHO. And she felt that she really wanted to make the point about eco guidelines. Clearly, she'd been picking up stuff on Twitter, that they were written specifically with the UK in mind, which I wasn't aware of, but also having to meet other countries' guidelines. And so she says, so the aim of the guidelines was to define A, good practice, and B, distinguish professional conservative restorers with specialist knowledge and experience from those who worked on heritage without these. Anyway, and there's something missing there, wasn't it? Yeah, absolutely. And then it finishes, we made the guidelines as good as we could possibly make them at the time, which I think is fair enough. You can't argue with that. But before the conference, originally Alison Richmond, CEO of ICON, was going to come to the conference, but due to other commitments she couldn't. But I did ask her 2 questions. I asked Alison, what are ICON's plans re a code of ethics in the UK? And how will ICON utilise the findings of the conference? So to the first question she answered, it's been agreed by the board that ICON's Professional Standards and Development Committee will take forward the recommendations of David Lee's review of ICON's disciplinary process, including a new code of conduct to be developed to replace the ECHO Code of Ethics, which is some years old and no longer appropriate. This should be based on PACR competencies. Bylaws would need to be updated, etc., but the hope is that that could be brought in potentially by the 2012 AGM. On to the second question. She said the findings of the conference will be fed back to the PSD, Professional Services, okay, yeah, which will be driving the process. Okay, so there is going to be what's happened today. Hopefully will go back and influence those discussions. And as to my own reflections on codes of ethics, I think the last bit has been particularly interesting because clearly in teaching one of the benefits you have is your students can access lots of different codes of ethics, then discuss them and debate them and then decide which ones work and which ones don't. And quite clearly there may well be something in that. And I've been looking recently at Restoration, Is It Acceptable?, published in 1994. And if you look at that as opposed to Conservation Principles, Dilemmas and Uncomfortable Truths, which was published a couple of years ago, I think it's a step change in complexity and thinking around the profession, in moving us forward, being able to deal with these more and more complex issues. And I think that the fact that ICON hasn't really had its own code of ethics and it hasn't really been a massive problem reflects perhaps the standard of teaching in the UK. And also reflects the fact that the profession is developing and is more confident around issues of complexity. And that complexity has really been reflected, as other speakers have noted, in the range of topics we've had to cover today. But every time, of course, when we deal with ethics, we want to bring it back to practice because that's where we're comfortable. We want to bring it back to an example that we're comfortable with and we can use to illustrate that. And I think that we need to take a step up in terms of thinking about ethics and how they work for us. So I'm not going to try and recap on the papers, but I'm going to try and sort of my basic recommends or views moving this forward. I think a code of ethics is really a guide for the people who do it, the conservators. And I think it's to inform the people we do it for, whether it be public or customers. I think if we look at previous codes, they were very detailed, and one of their weaknesses is that they always go down to really, they're more stratified and more level of detail. And if any of you have ever been in any kind of certainly national or even worse international forum where these issues get discussed, it's absolutely painful, the wordsmithing that goes on, the subtleties, the changes in meaning. And coming back to your point, Kieran, there's a real challenge in making a global set of ethics because meanings are so different in different countries. It's very, very challenging to do that. But it seems to me that we absolutely, I feel, need certainly a code of conduct, and whether there's a code of ethics that's separate to that. But it seems to me that they are conflated, and it's almost impossible to separate conduct from ethics because it's about how we conduct ourselves. We're judged in that way. And I thought also Kieran's point was very good about the fact that we all have ingrained ethics in the way that we live our lives, the things that we do day to day. But fundamentally, there has to be accountability for what we do or what the decisions that we make. And I think a code of ethics helps to define that accountability. Jonathan has mentioned the value and significance issues. It is really complicated. How do we start to break down those issues? But we need to engage in a discussion around issues of value and significance. And certainly in Australia at the moment, there's a lot riding on it. Significance seems to be the new black. And they believe that significance is going to save the conservation profession, and good luck to them if it does. But I do think they are complications, complicated issues there. However, I do think, coming back to my previous point, there are universal truths and some very simple truths. And I was sort of thinking of Asimov's laws of robotics. I think there were 3, and then he added another one on at the end. But there are some really core, simple truths I think that we could define, which are about truth and honesty, actually, in the way that we conduct ourselves and the way that we run our businesses. I also think it's about transparency as well. And there's a cost that comes with transparency. If you're going to be transparent, you have to be able to stand by your decisions. And people aren't necessarily going to agree with what you've done. No matter whatever code of conduct or code of ethics you roll out, there will be people that don't agree with what you've done. And Bob, we had those lovely illustrations of those paintings, and we know, again, if you read Art Watch on a regular basis, and the vitriol that goes on where conservatives are treated like decorators on crack, as a colleague of mine said.
You have that job.
But this is all about a step towards professionalisation, and I think that we've become more comfortable engaging with the public and understanding, working with the public and those broader stakeholders. But I think that's all about growing professionalisation. I do think a code of ethics, a code of conduct, has to look externally. It can't be something we just develop internally. There's lots of work that's been done on the general idea of ethics, and I think we have to look outside. External validation, I think, is very, very important, and we need to consider who those stakeholders might be. And we also can't ignore what's gone previously. So we have the various charters, the Venice Charter, Borough, Nara charters are in place. We have to reference some of that work that's gone before, difficult as that may be. And so this comes back, we always come back, we want codes of practice, but I do think that what ICON needs to do, in my opinion, is to link something into the PACR process, because it's a virtuous circle, in my opinion, and it needs to be dealt with. So those are my thoughts to finish the day. I wanted to say a really big thank you to all the speakers. It was a really tough ask for people to deliver in the way that they did and to join in, and it took everyone had to enter into the spirit of the day. So I'd just like everyone to put their hands together for all of our speakers. I'd also like to thank all of our panel members for their input today. I think you've been fantastic, so well done, everybody. And a few other thanks, obviously, to Ian Clark, who conceived of this, drove it through and got us all involved. Ian, well done. It's been a great day. Thank you. And specifically, Jane also had a lot to do with this in driving it through. But more importantly, all of the students that have helped us here today, you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Safe journey home, everybody.